The night I overheard my father tell my brother, "Your sister isn't worth a penny she's done," something inside me shattered. But it also set fire to everything I thought I knew about family. Before I share what happened, let me say this: our channel is brand new. Your support means the world. Please subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment telling me which subscriber number you became. Help me reach our first 1,000 family members right here. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The house smelled of cinnamon candles and roast ham, the kind of comfort that should have promised safety. But comfort has a way of disguising cracks. I was on my way to the guest room, walking slow down the hallway lined with old family portraits. That's when I noticed the study door left slightly open. At first, I thought it was nothing, but then I heard my father's voice. Low, firm, certain. "She's not worth a penny. David, your sister's done." I froze. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. My breath stuck in my throat as my brother's voice followed. Softer, almost apologetic. "But Dad, she's still..." My father cut him off. "No, you'll understand one day. The future of this family is in your hands, not hers." The words slid under my skin like ice water. My heart hammered so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. From my angle, I could see just enough. My father shuffling papers at his desk, my brother slouched on the sofa, and my mother standing by the window, silent as stone. Then her eyes flicked toward me. She saw me, and instead of shock, instead of shame, she smiled. A small, deliberate smile. The kind that said, "I know you heard, and I don't care." That smile hollowed me out more than my father's words. Because it wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was confirmation. As if my place in this family had been quietly revised, erased. Without my voice in the room, I stepped back into the hallway shadows, each memory of overlooked moments colliding into one sharp truth. The house suddenly felt colder, though the fire burned bright in the hearth. Every portrait on the wall seemed to whisper the same thing. "You never mattered here." By the time I reached the guest room, my hands trembled so badly I could barely close the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bland floral comforter. Downstairs, laughter drifted upward, casual and warm, as though nothing had broken. But something had. Something I knew I could never put back together. Sleep refused me that night. Instead, my mind reeled backwards, tallying a ledger of childhood moments that now made terrible sense. I remembered when David made the basketball finals his junior year. My parents flew across the country without hesitation, cheering until their throats went raw. That same week, I qualified for the state spelling championship. I went alone, escorted by my teacher. My parents had patted me on the shoulder and said, "You'll be fine." Double quotes fine. It became their favorite word. I learned early that recognition was a currency my parents spent only on my brother. For me, independence was expected, not celebrated. There was one exception. My grandmother, Eleanor. She lived in a small bungalow that always smelled of lavender and fresh bread. On weekends, she would sit with me at her kitchen table, spreading bills and bank statements across the wood. "Financial independence is freedom," she'd say, her eyes sharp, her tone steady. David would complain those visits were boring and usually stayed home. But I soaked in every word. When she passed during my senior year, she left me $12,000. Not much compared to David's full ride paid by my parents, but to me, it was treasure. My parents' reaction? My mother's casual remark at the will reading, "Well, Eleanor always favored you," as if a gift meant to support me was nothing more than a wedge between siblings. That inheritance became my ticket out. With scholarships and part-time jobs, I stretched every dollar, living inside margins so tight they sometimes cut. I thought I was free, until that night. Until the words I overheard. As I pressed my palms against the quilt, my mind snapped back to reality. The truth was clearer than ever. My father had written me off. My mother had co-signed that erasure with a smile. My brother, whether willingly or blindly, had accepted the throne built for him. But I wasn't done. I couldn't be. Because Eleanor hadn't just left me money. She had left me tools, knowledge, a quiet inheritance of resilience that my parents never intended me to have. And that night, in the silence of the guest room, with their laughter echoing from below. I made a promise. They had declared me worthless. I would prove them wrong. The dining room shimmered that evening, crystal glasses catching the light like prisms. Every detail was curated polished silver, folded linen napkins, candles placed just so. My mother thrived on appearances, on the illusion that this table meant we were whole. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say. Michael had asked me to marry him. The ring was simple, exactly what I'd hoped for, not flashy, not loud, just chosen with care. I wanted to share the joy, to watch their faces light up for me the way they always did for David. But I never got the chance. As I drew in a breath, David cleared his throat and launched into a new monologue. Another startup idea, another grand vision of success. My father leaned forward instantly, his eyes alive, peppering him with questions about investors and market trends. My mother's hand slid over David's like he was the meal itself, the centerpiece of the evening. I tried again. Quiet, but steady. I have something to share, Michael and I. The words slipped into the air like fragile glass and shattered. Because the moment they landed, my mother's lips curled into that familiar faint smile. The smile that said, "Yes, I heard you. And no, it doesn't matter." Seconds later, the conversation shifted back to David's brilliance. My engagement vanished into silence, like a fork dropped under the table. I sat there, staring at my untouched plate, realizing that in this family, my milestones weren't moments. They were inconveniences. Hours later, the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. I walked past the study, half hoping I was wrong, half dreading confirmation. The door stood ajar again, voices spilling through the gap. "The business, the house, the trust, it's all structured for David," my father said firmly. "She doesn't need any of it." I froze in the hallway. Every muscle coiled. David's uneasy nod followed, his silence as loud as the words themselves. My mother turned from the window, her reflection caught in the glass. She saw me standing there listening, and again, she smiled. Not kind, not apologetic, just certain. That smile carried me like a current back to the guest room, where I sat with my laptop glowing in the dark. Sleep was impossible. My mind spun with the echo of their voices, with that smile that burned hotter than fire. I opened the folders I had carried from Chicago. My records, my receipts, my careful ledgers, always organized, always ready. At first, I told myself it was just to distract me. But as the hours passed, the numbers sharpened into a story. Line after line revealed the truth. $500 sent home every month, stretching back nearly 7 years. A total of $41,000 wired faithfully into what I had believed was a family account, but then an entry that made my stomach drop. $7,500 pulled directly from my grandmother Eleanor's inheritance. My inheritance, disguised as a family investment. The date lined up perfectly with David's app launch, the one that fizzled before the ink dried on his business cards. No one had asked me. No one had repaid me. And then the deeper violation surfaced. Loan documents tied to my father's construction company. My name listed as guarantor. My credit leveraged without my knowledge. I remembered one Christmas, signing a stack of insurance forms my father had handed me. I hadn't realized what he'd slipped inside. The realization cut through me sharper than glass. So I began typing, page after page. I built my own record, not just numbers, but memories. The spelling championship I attended alone. The scholarships I fought for without applause. The dinners where David's sketches eclipsed every one of my achievements. 7 pages in total. Proof that I hadn't imagined the imbalance. Evidence against every denial I knew was coming. By the time dawn pushed pale light through the blinds, my hands ached from typing, but my mind was clear. The ledger was closed, the balance final. Now came the harder part, placing it in front of them. The kitchen was quiet that morning, still heavy with the smell of coffee grounds. I brewed a full pot, measured carefully, every scoop steady. 4 mugs sat on the dining table, one for each of us. Beside them, neat folders, my 7-page record tucked inside. When my father walked in, His eyes flicked to the stack. He paused, cautious, knowing before I even spoke that this wasn't breakfast. I gestured to his seat. "Sit down. We need to talk." My mother entered next, her perfume trailing like armor. David stumbled in last, hair mussed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. They sat. I slid a folder toward each of them. Inside is a complete record of every dollar I've contributed to this family since leaving for Chicago. $41,000 in transfers, $7,500 stolen from my inheritance, and fraudulent loan guarantees signed in my name. My father flipped a page, jaw tightening. "This is unnecessary. Families help each other. Business is complicated." "Help doesn't involve forgery," I said, my voice calm, measured. The tone I used in boardrooms. My mother's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her mug. "Darling, you're overreacting. Think of everything we've done for you. Your education, your opportunities." "My education was paid for with scholarships and jobs. My opportunities I carved myself. What you've done is siphoned my resources while telling me I don't matter." David sat silent, eyes scanning the papers, lips parted but no words forming. I let the silence press heavy over them. Then I pushed my chair back and stood. "I'm done. No more transfers. No more guarantees. I will not underwrite this family while being erased from it." The room seemed to shrink around us. The air felt thinner. For the first time, they saw me not as invisible, but undeniable, and they didn't know what to do with it. The polished table suddenly felt too small to contain the weight pressing down on it. My father's eyes narrowed, my mother's face paled, and David's fingers clenched tight around the folder I had placed in front of him. I had left the words there final, already bracing for what would come next. David was the first to break. His voice cracked, rough with disbelief. "Emma, you've misunderstood. Dad never meant you weren't included. These things are complicated. You're making it sound worse than it is." I met his eyes across the table, my voice steady, sharp as glass. "Did I misunderstand working nights at the library while you were given a car at 16? Did I misunderstand paying my own tuition at Northwestern while Mom and Dad covered every dollar of yours at Stanford? Did I misunderstand sending $500 a month while you lived rent-free in an apartment they furnished for you?" Color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed again. Words wouldn't come. I leaned forward, refusing to soften. "And the app launch you bragged about? The one that failed in less than a year. Do you know where part of the funding came from?" His brows knit together, uncertainty flickering. "Dad said $7,500. I cut in. From Grandma Eleanor's inheritance. Money she left me for education. Taken without my knowledge, without a word of repayment." The papers in his hands trembled as he scanned the proof. For the first time, he looked less like the golden son and more like a boy who had been living inside an illusion. His eyes turned toward our parents, voice rising. "Is this true? You took her money for my business? You've been using her transfers all these years?" My mother started to answer, her tone already smoothing into reason, but my father's sharp glance silenced her. That glance said everything. David's shoulders sagged. His confusion slipped into shame. For the first time, I saw the strings that had held him up all these years. Strings pulled by the same hands that had tied me down. The room tilted, the script slipping out of their control. David stared at the pages in front of him, unsure whether to keep reading or finally set them aside. I didn't wait for him to decide. I rose from the table. "I've already cut off every transfer. My accounts are locked. My credit is frozen. My firm's legal department has the fraudulent guarantees. You won't be using me again." The silence that followed was suffocating, thicker than smoke. I walked out. Back in the guest room, the house seemed to close in on me. Every polished surface reflected back a version of myself I no longer recognized. I pulled out my suitcase and began to pack. My movements were efficient, practiced. I'd done this 100 times for business trips, but this was different. This time, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. On my laptop, I canceled every authorization connected to the family accounts. The automatic transfers stopped with a few clicks. I placed freezes on my credit reports, sent encrypted messages to my firm's legal team. Each step cut another thread, loosening the net they'd woven around me. By the time dawn bled pale through the curtains, my suitcase stood by the door. I had already changed my flight to Boston, where a senior role awaited me. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a chance to start over, in a city where no one knew me as Richard and Sylvia's daughter, where my work stood on its own. Before leaving, I reached into my bag and pulled out the one thing I'd carried quietly all these years, the brass key to Eleanor's bungalow. It no longer opened any door, but it had always reminded me of safety, of freedom. At a small shop near the airport, I asked them to engrave a single word across its worn surface: boundaries. When I boarded the plane, the key rested warm in my palm. A final inheritance, not of money, but of meaning. As the wheels lifted off Portland's runway, I understood something vital. My life was no longer collateral for anyone else's debts. Months passed before the first message arrived. My mother's email dripped with sentiment, weaving childhood memories into pleas for understanding. She reminded me of birthdays, holidays, sacrifices supposedly made. But each line carried the weight of guilt, not love. I read it twice, then answered with 3 sentences: acknowledgement of receipt, clarification that I was well, and a reminder that future correspondence should be limited to matters requiring documentation. Weeks later, my father reached out, but his tone was strictly professional. He introduced me as a trusted consultant in letters to his business partners, hoping my name might salvage the credibility he had lost. I redirected each inquiry to my firm's general line. He received nothing more than the same automated response any other client would. The distance was firm, and I held it. David's call came later. Hesitant at first, his voice carried no excuses. Instead, he admitted what I had always suspected, that he had leaned on their support without asking where it came from, that he had accepted the advantages as natural, unquestioned. I thought I needed them, he said quietly, but maybe I just didn't know how to stand without the scaffolding. His words weren't a demand. They were recognition. For the first time, I believed he might learn to carry his own weight. In Boston, I built something Eleanor would have been proud of. I established a scholarship in her name, dedicated to teaching young women the same lessons she once spread across her kitchen table: budgeting, credit, independence. Applications filled my inbox, stories from students eager to learn. Each one reminded me her legacy had never been the money. It was the knowledge, the belief that worth could be built, not given. The past still pressed against me sometimes, but it no longer dictated my balance sheet. I was investing in futures that saw value where mine had once been denied, and every time I held Eleanor's key in my hand, I knew the truth. Boundaries weren't walls. They were doors I chose to lock. Boston welcomed me with the smell of salt in the air and the steady hum of a city that never seemed to pause. My apartment overlooked the Charles River, sunlight flickering across the water like gold dust scattered by the wind. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living under someone else's ceiling. I decorated sparingly: a bookshelf, a desk by the window, a soft chair where I could read at night. But above my desk, in a simple black frame, hung the brass key Eleanor once pressed into my hand. The engraving glinted faintly in the afternoon light. Boundaries. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a compass, a reminder that the locks I chose mattered more than the doors that had been closed to me. At my new firm, I was no longer the daughter of Richard and Sylvia. I was Emma Carter, senior financial analyst. My ideas were debated, my reports respected, my presence valued. No comparisons, no invisible scale measuring me against someone else's worth. My workdays filled quickly: strategy meetings, client calls, late nights poring over numbers that told stories of risk and possibility. But for the first time, exhaustion felt like growth, not depletion. And beyond work, something unexpected bloomed. Michael. He was a colleague at first, sharp, patient, and disarmingly kind. Where others spoke over me, he listened. Where others saw competition, he saw partnership. Slowly, lunches turned into long walks, meetings into conversations that stretched into the evening. He never asked me to explain my past, but when I chose to, he didn't flinch. He didn't pity me. He simply said, You deserved better, and now you get to choose better. It was a simple sentence, but it unlocked something in me that even Eleanor's key hadn't managed. 2 years later, when Michael and I married, the ceremony was small. A hall with windows opening onto the harbor. Friends and colleagues gathered close. No extravagant displays, no expectations to impress. Just vows spoken with sincerity and laughter spilling through the room. David came alone. His suit was ill-fitting, his expression subdued. He offered quiet congratulations, his handshake lingering a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to communicate what words could not. He didn't defend the ones who stayed away. That silence was its own kind of reckoning. The absence of my parents did not hollow the day. Instead, it confirmed what I had already learned. Family isn't defined by bloodlines or shared last names. It's defined by those who invest in your worth without demanding repayment. My grandmother had known that truth long before I did. She planted it in me, and I carried it here, into this life I built without scaffolding. In the evenings, I often sat beneath the framed key. Sometimes Michael joined me, his hand warm against mine as we watched a river shift beneath the city lights. The key no longer opened Eleanor's bungalow, but it unlocked something far greater. Freedom earned, dignity reclaimed, love chosen rather than owed. Boston didn't erase the past, but it gave me room to write new chapters. Meanwhile, the old TIs tugged faintly at the edges of my life. My mother sent messages dripping with guilt, her words like vines trying to creep back under the door. My father occasionally reached out under the guise of business, hoping my credibility could patch the holes in his. Each time, I answered with boundaries sharp as steel, polite, firm, distant. David, however, was different. Over time, his calls became less hesitant. He no longer asked for anything. Instead, he confessed small truths: how he had relied on scaffolding he didn't know was stolen, how he was trying to stand on his own. There was no request for forgiveness, just recognition. For the first time, I believed he might actually find his own footing. The scholarship in Eleanor's name grew. Dozens of young women applied each year, their essays filled with determination, their questions echoing the same fears I had once carried. How do you build credit? How do you budget when every dollar matters? How do you believe in your worth when no one else seems to? Each story reminded me, Eleanor's true gift wasn't money. It was knowledge, independence, the quiet but unshakable belief that no one could determine your value but you. When I read those applications, I felt her presence more strongly than I ever had in my parents' house. Her legacy wasn't buried in a will or tied to a trust. It was alive, moving through these young women, each one a door opening into a future she would have celebrated. One night, as the city hummed below our window, Michael found me tracing the engraving on the key. "You still think about them?" he said softly. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not in the way I used to. It doesn't weigh me down anymore. It just reminds me of how far I've come." He kissed the top of my head. That's the thing about boundaries. They don't just keep others out, they keep your peace in. I smiled, because he was right. The key was no longer a relic of what I lost. It was a symbol of everything I had chosen. And as I looked out at the river shimmering in the moonlight, I knew the future waiting beyond my door was one I would open entirely on my own terms. Sometimes late at night, I stand at the window of my Boston apartment and watch the Charles River shimmer beneath the city lights. The water flows steady and sure, never pausing, never looking back. I used to envy that kind of certainty, movement without hesitation. Now, I realize it isn't certainty at all. It's faith. Faith that the path forward is worth more than the places already passed. Months had turned into years, and the distance between me and my parents had stretched into silence. At first, I wondered if the quiet would hurt. But the truth? It healed. Without their constant weight pressing down, I began to hear my own voice more clearly. The voice that had been silenced at dinner tables, dismissed in living rooms, erased in study doors left ajar. It rose stronger now, steady and confident, carrying me into rooms I once thought were close to me. At work, I led projects that reshaped entire portfolios. Colleagues sought my advice. Clients trusted my judgment. For the first time, I wasn't fighting to be seen. I was simply seen at home. Michael and I built something even rarer. Peace. Our apartment filled with laughter and the quiet rhythms of ordinary love, shared meals, late-night conversations, the warmth of his hand in mine. There were no ledgers here, no debts tallied, only choice, only commitment. But the part of me that once carried Eleanor's lessons still longed to give them away. So I poured more of myself into the scholarship. What began as a small program grew into a network: mentorships, workshops, opportunities for young women who, like me, had been told they weren't worth investing in. Each letter from a recipient reminded me of the girl I once was, hungry to prove herself, starved for recognition, fighting battles no one else seemed to notice. But unlike me, these young women didn't have to fight alone. I sat with them, shared my mistakes, guided them through budgets, contracts, choices. I saw the spark in their eyes when they realized they were capable, when they saw their worth not as a question but as a fact. That was Eleanor's true inheritance. Not money, not property, knowledge, dignity, boundaries. One evening, after a long day of interviews for the scholarship, I returned home to find Michael waiting with 2 glasses of wine. "You look like you've carried the whole world today," he teased, handing me a glass. "Not the world," I said, sinking into the couch. "Just a dozen futures," he smiled, clinking his glass against mine. "That sounds heavier than the world." I laughed, but in my chest, pride bloomed. Heavy, yes, but worth it. Sometimes memories of my family still surfaced. A flash of Sylvia's knowing smile, Richard's dismissive tone, David's uneasy silence, but the sting was gone. In its place was something quieter: acceptance. I no longer needed their approval to validate my existence. I no longer feared their erasure because I had written my own record, line by line, with proof stronger than any denial. And when I thought of Eleanor, I no longer grieved. I celebrated. Her key still hung above my desk, the word boundaries gleaming in the light. It no longer reminded me of closed doors. It reminded me of the ones I had opened: doors to independence, to love, to legacy. The day Michael and I welcomed our daughter into the world, I held her tiny fingers and felt the past, present, and future converge. She would never grow up questioning her worth in her parents' eyes. She would never be told her value depended on silence or sacrifice. She would know, from the very beginning, that her voice mattered, that her boundaries were sacred, that her life was hers alone to build. As I whispered her name, I thought of Eleanor, and I knew the cycle had ended. Not long after, I received one final letter from David. His handwriting was shaky, his words uneven, but honest. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness," he wrote, "but I've started over. I'm working now. Not for Dad, not for anyone else, for myself. And I want you to know, I'm finally learning to stand on my own." I folded the letter carefully, placing it in the same drawer where Eleanor's old photographs rested. It wasn't reconciliation, not exactly, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, I had learned, were worth cherishing. As the years stretched on, I built a life that would have been unrecognizable to the girl sitting alone in her childhood bedroom, silenced and unseen. I built it with love, with purpose, with boundaries that protected my peace and amplified my worth. And every time I looked at that brass key, I was reminded, I am not a ledger in someone else's account. I am not collateral for someone else's dreams. I am not an afterthought in someone else's story. I am my own investment, my own legacy, my own proof. And no matter what doors had been closed, I held the key to opening the ones that mattered. So when people ask me about my past, I tell them this. Once, my father told my brother I wasn't worth a penny, that I was done. But I proved him wrong, because worth is never given. It is claimed. And once you claim it, no one can take it from you. The river keeps moving. The key keeps shining. And my life, at last, is wholly, undeniably mine.